guys, how are you doing? Are you excited to be here? Another night of review. Periods 3 and 4 tonight. It's storming outside, so we'll see how long this lasts. Actually, it says my connection is excellent, so hopefully that is true. I went ahead and posted in the chat. I don't know if you guys saw it or if when you log in, if it's there or not. If you have any questions left over from last night, I had a couple people that posted a few questions right as I was ending the stream, and I typed in an answer in the chat, but I don't know if they saw it. So if you have questions from last night's review, which is periods 1 and 2, which goes from 1491 up to 1754, go ahead and throw them in the chat, and I'll address them as they come up. That said, what I want you guys to do is, if you have questions at any point, don't wait until I finish a unit or until I'm ready to move on to something else. Go ahead, put those questions in the chat as they come up. I'll continually look at that and make sure that I'm answering the questions you need answered. Is there a specific time period that you would focus on for this year's exam? Afrin, no, you got to hit the whole thing. Now, I will tell you that periods 3 through 8, 3 through 8 are the meat, more 4 through 8. So 1800 to, the 8 ends in 1980. So 1800 to 1980, that's the bulk of the exam. And that's where your DBQs are going to come from and stuff like that. So, but honestly, everything is fair game. And it's not like you go from one year to the other where they say, oh, last year we focused more on, colonial times and early America. So this year we're going to focus more on modern America. It's the broad spectrum. Now, especially on this digital exam where you guys are going to have 5 SAQs, that's a propensity of 5 different time periods being tested. So that's a real possibility. And then you throw in the DBQ, and that's the 6th time period right there. So I think for this one, you need to be prepared to go, from, periods 3 all the way through 8, and maybe, just review like what we talked about last night. I wouldn't spend a whole lot of time on that, just have a good working knowledge of that. But we're starting to get into what I call the meat of history, the beginning of America, and especially going into period 4. That's when a lot of stuff starts happening, okay? So that's, I'm sorry, that's probably not the way I answered you. You probably wanted me to say, hey, just study periods 4 and 5 and you'll be golden. I just can't say that, so, okay? All right, but like I said, we are studying periods 3 and 4 tonight. Again, I'm going to do my best to keep it under an hour, but I'm a realist, and I know that there's so much we need to talk about. It's probably going to go a little bit longer. But let's go ahead and get started. I got my notes ready. Hopefully you guys are ready to take some notes, and let's just get right into it. Let me go ahead and pull up our note sheets for tonight, and let me share this with you. Got that. Let me get this over here. Got too many screens up. One day I'm going to learn to balance all my screens. All right, here we go. Question number 1. Big idea for number 1 tonight. The French and Indian War led to an increased land for the American colonies. So the French and Indian War led to increased land for the American colonies. So we're going right into the French-Indian War. Now, just so you basically know, the French-Indian War was a conflict between Great Britain and France. The colonies got sucked into it because of the land over here in North America. The conflict is over control of the Ohio River Valley. Both Great Britain and France wanted it, and they were both claiming it at this point. The colonists want to move west. I think westward expansion is just ingrained in American blood. So the colonists supported Great Britain in this war, in that's going to offer them more land once they win. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of the war. It's pretty much there was a fight over North American land. Great Britain's going to win, and what that's going to do is it's going to double their land holdings in North America. They now control all the land west to the Mississippi. France is literally out of North America. They lose all of their land holdings. With that, since the colonists fought alongside Great Britain in this war, they felt a sense of entitlement. It's like, we fought in this war, so we, get the spoils of war. And so they want to start moving west. The problem is you have the Native Americans out there. And there's going to be one key event that's going to show Great Britain that they can't manage the entire mass of the North American land that they now have control of. And that's going to be Pontiac's rebellion. And Pontiac, excuse me, let me get this. Pontiac and his Native American Confederacy are going to fight against the colonists moving into this new territory. Great Britain can't protect them all. So this is when the Parliament of Great Britain is going to pass the Proclamation Line of 1763. What this line did was it divided the colonial land and Native American land in North America. But this is going to upset the colonists because this line is put in place to keep them from expanding west. They're not allowed to go past that line. And like I said, they feel entitled that they should be able to do this. On top of that, due to the cost of the war, I mean, the cost of the French-Indian War is literally going to double the debt that Great Britain is carrying at this point. And because of that, Great Britain is going to start implementing taxes on the colonists. Now, they are well within their rights to do this. They are the mother country and everything like that. On top of that, they have to pay for the maintenance of the colonies as far as troops and, just governing and stuff like that. So who else is going to pay for all this but the colonists? But, the colonists see this, though, as almost a slap in the face. We helped you win the war. Now you're charging us taxes. You won't let us expand. And what's really happening here, guys, is that period of salutary neglect is coming to an end. Great Britain is reinforcing her authority over the colonies. Now, it was more of an economic authority, but the colonists see this as a threat. So they're going to start, instead of ignoring the Navigation Acts, they're going to start enforcing the Navigation Acts. And the smuggling that was going on beforehand that the English did nothing about, now they're starting to crack down on it. As a result of the enforcement of the Navigation Acts, as a punishment of smugglers, and some of these new taxes like the Stamp Act and other legislative actions made by Parliament, like the Quartering Act, where they're sending more soldiers over here and the colonists have to provide them housing. What's going to happen is you're going to see the Stamp Act Congress come together. Now, we always like to say, as soon as taxes were thrown out, that the colonists were all about independence right away. 1765, the Stamp Act Congress, independence was not on the table. They're not seeking it. They still want to be part of the British Empire. And what the Stamp Act Congress did was they petitioned Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act. Now, you're going to have some pushback in the colonies to the Stamp Act. You're going to have the Sons and Daughters of Liberty. You're going to have boycotts. You're going to have, some activity, scaring off the tax collectors and stuff like that. But the Stamp Act Congress, all they asked for was a repeal of the Stamp Act. And Parliament said yes, and they repealed the Stamp Act. But then they started passing other acts as well. I mean, it didn't stop with that. For instance, the Townshend Acts are going to come in, which was a tax on a number of products and stuff like that. So that's what's going on in the 1760s. It's more or less Great Britain trying to re-exert its control over the colonies, and the colonies not liking it because they've been able to do whatever they wanted now for 150 years, and why do you want to enforce rules on us now? The big idea that's going to come out of this is what the colonists are complaining about the most is Parliament is taxing them without representation in Parliament. The colonists have no representation. This ties back to a lot of the ideas of the Enlightenment that I talked about last night. Remember the Enlightenment, we talked about, the social contract that government has with the people, that it's the government's job to protect the rights of people. And the colonists felt like their rights were being ignored. Now, Great Britain's going to argue you have representation. It's called virtual representation. And Parliament, it doesn't matter your location or your class or anything like that. You are a member of the English Empire, so Parliament is representing you. But the Stamp Act Congress didn't buy that at this point, so the whole no taxation without representation is going to come to light during this time. Going through these taxes, it's more or less a back and forth between some of our representatives and parliament and stuff like that, with Sons of Liberty operating in the background. But once we get into the 1770s, some key events really start to turn the tide towards this fight for independence. The first one is in 1770, which is the Boston Massacre, when blood is going to be spilled. And that's going to be picked up by all the newspapers of the colonies, and the story is going to spread throughout. And there's going to start being these questions about, well, if it happened there, what's to stop it from happening here? And then fast forward a few years, and you're going to have the Boston Tea Party, a protest to the Tea Act, which was an attempt to monopolize the sale of tea in the colonies. Well, when that happens, Parliament is going to pass the Intolerable Acts. Once those Intolerable Acts go down, you're basically seeing all the colonies start to look at coming together and saying, whoa, let's really renegotiate or reconfigure our relationship with Great Britain. And so that's what's going on during this time. And I completely skipped over big idea number 2. I just realized that as I went into that. So let me go back to that. We'll look at big idea number 2, where I'll read it to you. It says British colonial policies, specifically taxation without colonial representation in Parliament, led to the Revolutionary War. And that's where we're at. That's where we're at here at about 1773, 1774, where you have the colonists who are now questioning, is this the relationship we want, or do we want something new? And remember, from the Enlightenment, we were told, or we learned, that if a government does not represent or doesn't respect the rights of its people or protect the rights of its people, the people have the right to get out of that social contract, to say, we're not going to give you that power anymore. In fact, we're going to change our government. And that's what you're going to start seeing happening around 1774, 1775, as like the First and Second Continental Congress come together. Okay, so that's big idea number 2. Now we're going to jump to big idea number 3. Big idea number 3 says the Enlightenment ideals exhibited major influence on the American independence movement, especially exhibited in Thomas Paine's Common Sense and the Declaration of Independence. Now, guys, whenever you see something listed in specific names listed in the key concepts of the APUSH curriculum, you got to know that. And both Common Sense and the Declaration of Independence are both in the key concepts. So we know that the Enlightenment is, like I just talked about, John Locke and natural rights, we give, government is supposed to protect our rights of life, liberty, and property. We have, that's the big idea that came from the Enlightenment. Another big idea that's going to come is that social contract, that we give power to the governed, we hold the power, and we give some of that power to government to rule over us and to protect our rights. But it's a contract between us and the governing authority. And the third big idea that's going to come out of the Enlightenment is this idea of separation of powers, that all the power of government is not in the hand of one person or one group of people. So these are going to influence the Continental Congress, the First and Second Continental Congress, and the members of that. Now, Thomas Paine is going to write the pamphlet Common Sense. And he basically is arguing in January of 1776, late 1775, that we should have independence. And if you look at the writings of Common Sense, you're going to see it's a combination of some biblical ideas along with Enlightenment ideas. And from the publication of Common Sense, you are going to see this independence movement start to grow in the colonies. And we're on the path now. Now, when we get to the point of no return, we go through negotiations, we fought in the battles and everything like that, we actually draft the Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration of Independence, line by line, outlines why we are declaring independence and the reasons we hold the king and parliament responsible for that. We basically said that, the Declaration, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed with certain unalienable rights by their Creator, This is Thomas Jefferson pulling directly from John Locke's Natural Rights. And John Locke said life, liberty, and property. Thomas Jefferson, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So that's where you see natural rights in the Declaration of Independence. You also see a statement about that social contract that we are that to secure the rights of man, the governments are to institute. Government should be instituted among men, and provided that men give their consent for that government. So again, government's job, according to the Enlightenment and according to our founders, is to protect our natural rights. Okay? So common sense Declaration of Independence, two big things that you need to be familiar with going forward. All right, big idea number 4. Despite Britain's military and financial advantages, the American Patriots won the Revolutionary War and gained independence. All right, so basically going into the war, you have the Loyalists and you have the Patriots, and that's exactly who they were. You have the people who are loyal to Great Britain, and you have the Patriots, those who are fighting for independence. And on paper, guys, there is no way we should have been able to beat Great Britain. But what we had that they didn't have was we had the leadership of George Washington. And I think that made the biggest difference. Now, the first few years are going to be tough. It's going to be very difficult trying to find our way. But there's going to be several key moments. And the biggest moment you should be familiar with is the major turning point in the war. And that's going to be the Battle of Saratoga. Now, the Battle of Saratoga is actually pretty early in the war. It's about 1777 is when that takes place. And what happens there is, because of our victory at Saratoga, we are going to get help. There is no way we could have won this war without help. And so Saratoga is going to give the French the confidence to come in and ally themselves with us, and they're going to bring Spain with them. And that's going to turn everything around. Then we're going to continue fighting. The final battle of the American Revolution is going to be the Battle of Yorktown. And, with that, America has won her independence. So, like I said, on paper, we are going up against one of the strongest militaries in the world. And we still won. But we couldn't have done it without the help of the French, which came after Saratoga. All right, big idea number 5. The Articles of Confederation was the first constitution of the United States of America. And it failed largely because the federal government was too weak. We had to have a government in place. We couldn't just say, okay, let's declare our independence, but not have a plan in place. And what's going to happen is, just before, during, and actually after the war, you start seeing state governments or the individual states creating their own governments and writing their own state constitutions. And when it came time to put the Articles of Confederation together, quite honestly, they're going to draw a lot of influence from those state constitutions. And when we're talking about these ideas that they're pulling from the state government, these state governments were focused on them holding all the power, and the power going to the individual states, not to a centralized government. And so that's how the Articles of Confederation are going to be designed, is all of the federal power is going to be lodged into one legislative body, a Congress, if you will, but just a unicameral Congress. They're just going to have a representative from each state. There's not going to be an executive. There's not going to be a judicial. And then on top of that, the power that was given to this Congress is very limited. There's no national military. There's no provision for taxation or anything like that. There's like I said, no judicial, so there's no way to alleviate any conflicts between the states or anything like that. Really, the Articles of Confederation. I mean, I've said it in class, and I've stolen this from Hip Hugh's history. I learned this from him long ago. But simply put, the Articles of Confederation sucked because the Fed was just too weak. Our federal government was way too weak to get anything accomplished. And all of this is going to come to a head, and is really going to come to light when we deal with what's known as Shea's Rebellion. Shea's Rebellion is actually going to demonstrate how weak the Articles of Confederation were. basically you had farmers up in western Massachusetts who are going to lodge a revolt against the Massachusetts state government. And we realized that we didn't have a military or any mechanism to put a revolution down. And so because of that, you're going to see the leadership of America become very alarmed with the Articles and actually look to, how can we fix it? On top of that, America is experiencing a very weak and struggling economy at the time. And since the Articles, you have no power to tax. You can't deal with that. So all of this is happening at once. And what happens if we have more rebellions? They were able to put Shea's rebellion down when they hired an army, but what if there's more? And there probably would have been a lot more. So that's when discussion about fixing the Articles of Confederation is going to start. But before I go on to big idea number 6, where we talk about that, one good thing did come out of the Articles of Confederation, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention it, and that's going to be the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 is basically going to take what was the Northwest Territory of America at this point, which is up near the Great Lakes as you go west towards the Mississippi, and it's going to establish a way for new states to enter into the country. And in doing that, we're actually going to use the Northwest Ordinance as a guide to bring more states into the Union. The other thing, and probably more important part of the Northwest Ordinance that can't be overlooked, is the fact that they abolished slavery in the Northwest Territory. Slavery would not be allowed in that region. So any state that comes into the Union from that territory would not be allowed to have slavery. You did also have, right after the American Revolution, a movement through the North towards emancipation, towards the abolishment of slavery. Some states just abolished it completely, but other states are going to do this very slow, gradual emancipation. But they're moving towards ending slavery in the northern part of our country. Okay? All right, let's go to big idea number 6. Big idea number 6. The Constitutional Convention was called to draft a new constitution to rectify the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. So guys, that was the original plan. We're going to fix the Articles of Confederation. We're not going to, there was no plan to actually create a brand new constitution. We're just going to review what we have and find a way to fix it. But what we realized right away, this can't be fixed. We just have to chunk it out and we have to start new. And what we're going to see is two groups kind of guide how the Constitution is going to be structured. You're going to have the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist. And when you look at these two groups, the Federalists supported a strong central government. The Anti-Federalists supported a weaker central government, more power going to the states. In fact, a lot of the Anti-Federalists supported rewriting the Articles of Confederation. So that's kind of the attitudes going into this convention. Now, one of the biggest, if not the biggest debate during the Constitutional Convention is going to be the question of representation. How should states be represented in this Congress, and how many representatives should they have? This is when we start seeing states garnering or lobbying for more power at the federal government. And so you had two key plans that are going to come to the floor. You're going to have the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan. Now, the Virginia plan introduced a bicameral legislature, two houses in the Congress. But both of those houses would be populated by representatives based on population of the states. So the larger states, the more populated states would have more representatives in those two houses. So that's the Virginia plan. The New Jersey plan took a more conservative approach to it. They say we just want a one-house legislature, very similar to what we had under the Articles of Confederation, and all the states have equal representation. Well, you can see the difference between these two major plans, and what's going to happen is what we call the Great Compromise. We call it the Great Compromise. I heard someone say the other day, I don't think they called it the Great Compromise. They just called it a compromise. But basically what it did was it took parts of both plans. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a bicameral legislature with a House of Representatives, and a Senate. The House of Representatives will be based on population. So the larger populated states are going to have more representatives in the House. But the Senate is going to have equal representation, meaning that every state will have the exact same number of representatives. So if you look at our Senate today, every state has 2 senators. Whether they have 500,000 people living in their state, like say Wyoming, or they have 13 million people living in their state, like California. They each have just 2 representatives. Now, once that happens, the question is, how do we count population? And of course, you've got to look at the slaves, and that's what the big discussion was on. Should we count the slaves towards population? This is where the 3/5 compromise is going to come in. All the states are going to agree that the slave population for each state, and states, north to south had slaves. Obviously, the states in the south had more. But what they said is they're going to take the total population of slaves, and 3/5 of that number will represent population to be counted for representation. So if you have 10,000 slaves in your state, they're going to add the number 6,000 to your population, and then they'll base representation on that. Keep in mind, and be very careful because I see this mistake a lot, that doesn't mean that 3/5 of the slaves all of a sudden have rights. They're just a number at this point, and that's all they're seen as, is just a number. The other thing that's going to be created under the Constitution, and I go back to those Enlightenment ideas, is going to be the separation of powers. We will have 3 branches of government. We'll have the legislative branch, an executive branch, which will be the president, and then the judicial branch, which will be represented by the Supreme Court. So we're going to see the division of power in the government, so that fear of how all that power in the hands of one or a group is now alleviated. So once the Constitution has been negotiated, once it's been drafted, so we're in 1787 right now we got to get it ratified. And now here comes the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists all over again debating on whether or not this should be ratified. The Federalists are going to be represented in a series of essays called the Federalist Papers by Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison. And they're going to write a series of 66 essays defending why the Constitution should be ratified. At the same time, the Anti-Federalists they're going to write some essays too, not nearly the number, but they're also going to write and try to persuade people not to ratify the Constitution. Well, what's going to end up happening is you're going to have another compromise where the Anti-Federalists are going to agree to ratify the U.S. Constitution if a Bill of Rights, if a list of individual rights are added to that Constitution. And that's what gets us the first 10 amendments to our U.S. Constitution, and those are put in place. And see, guys, what the Anti-Federalists were worried about was a federal government that had too much power. So what they're really pushing for is a very detailed, enumerated list of what the government can and can't do. And if it's not in the U.S. Constitution, then that's not a power that the government has. In fact, if you look at the 10th Amendment, the 10th Amendment actually is the amendment that guarantees power for the states, because the 10th Amendment explicitly says that if it's not in the Constitution, then it automatically belongs to the state. It's a state power. And that takes us right into big idea number 7, that the Constitution of the United States created a new central government that is defined by federalism and the separation of powers. Let's talk about this idea of federalism. Federalism is the division of power between federal government and a state government. And each group, each government represents a certain set of powers that they can have. And again, if it's not in the Constitution according to the 10th Amendment, it automatically becomes the power of the state. Now, these enumerated or these listed powers, that are in the Constitution all belong to the federal government. Powers not listed, we refer to those as reserve powers. Those go to the states. So the question then is, when we look at the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists, how are we going to interpret this Constitution going forward? And we're going to look at that, because this is going to be what we see with our Federalists and Anti-Federalists is we're slowly moving towards a political party system in our government. But before we get to that, before we go any further, I do want to talk about big idea number 8. The ideals of the American Revolution affected society in America in the term of gender roles and debates about slavery, while they also inspired revolutions in France and Haiti. So here we are, a brand new country. We won our revolution. Now we've developed a brand new constitution, a brand new government, and that's inspirational to a lot of people. And we're going to see that a lot of the ideals of the why we fought the revolution and why we're creating this constitution, they're going to bleed into our society, and they're going to bleed into other parts of the world. Let's talk about society first. And we were just talking about slavery, so let's kind of go back to it. This idea of, with the 3/5 compromise and everything like that, is what we're doing is we see this renewed debate about the morality of slavery come up during the Constitutional Convention. I had mentioned to you that the northern states had already started practicing some gradual emancipation. So and then you also had the Northwest Ordinance that abolished slavery. So you were starting to see this idea of questioning the morality of slavery kind of start to bubble up. Is it overflowing? Is it becoming the forefront of political debate among the people? No. But we see a renewed interest in it during this time period. So put that in your back pocket and hold on to it, okay? Because, this question of slavery is going to be woven throughout everything for the next 100 years in our history. Let's talk about women. We haven't really talked about women that much since we started this. And during the American Revolution, women are going to be given a role in society, and that role is Republican motherhood. And the idea is that it is the role of women that they have this purpose to raise virtuous sons that would be then be instructed in the ideas of this liberty that we were creating our country on. So it's up to the women now to teach their young sons how to be good American citizens. Now, we might look at this today as women and say, "Oh my, really? That's their role, to teach the men how to be good citizens." But at this time, again, I've talked about it many times, put yourself in the shoes of the people who lived the history. At the time, this was a very dignified role in society, okay? So just keep that in mind. So Republican motherhood, that's one of those key terms you've got to know. Now, our revolution also inspired other revolutions, specifically the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution, right about, both going on about the same time, 1780s, 1790s. Now, basically, the French Revolution is going to be based on the ideals of freedom, the right to have the consent to political leadership, so the right to choose your own government, and they're going to fight their own French Revolution, or this fight for independence, where they'll create their own declaration and stuff. The island of Haiti, though, is very interesting, because Haiti was predominantly predominantly black men living down there, most of them living in slavery, but they were owned by France. So those ideals that are inspiring the French Revolution are going to start inspiring the people in Haiti as well. And you're going to see this revolution start to boil up, and what it actually turns into is a revolt led predominantly by the slaves on the island of Haiti. And they are actually going to win this revolution and put in their own government. It's the very first successful, really the only successful slave revolt that we see in American history. And it was inspired by the American Revolution. So both the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution are mentioned in the key concepts. So just have a working knowledge of both those. Know that they were inspired by the same ideals that inspired the Americans to fight for their independence as well. All right, we're moving. Let's go to big idea number 9. The presidencies of George Washington and John Adams are going to set the precedents for the way America would behave regarding the relationship between the federal government and state governments, economic policy, and foreign policy. So we are already, here we are in the first 2 presidencies of America, and that's going to be George Washington and John Adams. And both of these men are going to basically set the stage or create the template of what the presidency is going to look like. Now, during this time, specifically during the time period of Washington's presidency, that's when we're going to see the formation of formal political parties. You're going to have the Federalist Party, which was basically an offshoot, a continuance of the Federalists of the Constitutional Convention. And then you're going to have the Democratic Republicans, who I guess you could make an argument were an offshoot of the Anti-Federalists, okay? So there is a big difference between these 2 groups of people, between these 2 political parties. And a lot of it is what boils down to is the relationship between the federal government and the state governments. Now, the Federalists, they believed in what we call a loose interpretation of the Constitution, meaning that the Constitution was flexible, that there was no possible way that you could write everything you knew. Hey, Jessica, how you doing? That you could write everything you needed to in the Constitution to cover everything that could ever happen for the future of America. And that's where they said you have to be a little bit more flexible with the Constitution, almost like an elastic band is on a pair of pants. And that's why we have the elastic clause, also known as the necessary and proper clause. But the Democratic Republicans are like, no, we believe in a strict interpretation of the Constitution. If it's not in there, you can't do it. It's that simple. And so that's the baseline of the difference between these two political parties. And you're really going to see this come to a head when we were discussing the economic system of our new country. And, Alexander Hamilton is going to introduce this economic system that's going to be centered around tariffs, it's going to be centered around taxes, and it's going to be centered around a national bank. And the argument is going to be that this national, because we have tariffs, we're collecting taxes. We have tariffs coming in for imports. Then we're going to collect taxes from, whiskey and stuff like that. We're getting all this money. We got to have a place to put it. So we need a national bank. Well, the Democratic Republicans, who are going to be led by Thomas Jefferson, are going to say it's not in there. It's not in the Constitution, so that can't be constitutional. So they're going to debate this back and forth, and obviously they're going to come up with their own compromise to allow this financial plan to come forward. But the debate really is, should the federal government have the power to meddle in state problems? I mean, we're looking at what they can do on the federal level, but the Democratic Republicans are also worried about what they can do at the state level. And when this is really going to come to a head is during the Whiskey Rebellion. Once again, we have some farmers rising up and fighting against the local government. And what's going to happen here, though, is the federal government is going to exercise its power that they now have from this brand new Constitution. They're going to raise an army, and they're going to take that army into western Pennsylvania, and they're going to put down this rebellion. And so the fact that these federal troops were used for what a lot of people saw as a state issue caused a lot of concern for the Democratic Republicans. Okay? So you're seeing George Washington. This is during his presidency and everything. Now, George Washington didn't deal a lot with foreign policy. He was dealing mostly with creating what the presidency was going to look like, creating how our government was going to function here in the nation. But with foreign policy, he just took this attitude of neutrality. We're just going to stay out of the problems that are going on over in Europe. That's not going to be the same when we get to John Adams. John Adams is mostly going to be focused on foreign policy. And the big thing that's going to happen with him is going to be the Xyz Affair. we're having trouble with France seizing our ships, the ships that we're trying to use for trade and stuff like that. So Adams is going to send some representatives over to France to negotiate into all of this, and that's when the XYZ affair is going to occur, when these French delegates say, hey, we're not going to let you talk to anybody until you give us money. So they basically bribed them, saying, you can't talk to our leadership until you pay us off. And what's going to happen is that, Adams is going to say, they're going to say no to that, and Adams is going to have a big, support back home on how he stood up to the French government in the XYZ affair. So things were good with Adams there, with his regards to foreign policy. Where things started to go bad was because of these problems with France. Because of all of that, hang on just a second. Because of that, we are going to go into, Adams and Congress are going to pass what's known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien and Sedition Acts are going to basically set precedents that would make it easy to deport non-citizens from our country and make it illegal to talk bad about our government. Now, we know, looking at that is unconstitutional. That when you limit the free speech of the press, you limit the free speech of the American people, that's an unconstitutional act. Yet, the Sedition Acts are going to be passed. The response to the Sedition Acts is very important, and that's going to be the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. The Virginia and Kentucky resolutions are going to basically say, written by James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, they're going to say, if the federal government passes a law that the states deem unconstitutional, such as the Sedition Acts, then the states can nullify those laws. They can ignore those laws and just set them aside. This is that setting up that stage for a battle between federal and state government. And we're going to hear a lot about nullification as we move forward. And it all starts here with the presidency of John Adams. So Washington and Adams, they're going to set these precedents moving forward for the presidency. Give me just a second here, guys. Okay, there we go. So let's go on to now big idea number 10. And big idea number 10 basically says ideas about American national identity found expression in art, literature, architecture, and while there were national expressions of American identity, there were also strong regional representations as well. So what we're going to see during this time as we come out of the end of period 3 is we're going to start to see the creation of an American national identity. And we start to look at how do we see ourselves as Americans. No longer British citizens, no longer colonists, but actual Americans. And we're going to see that, like I said in the big idea, in our art, in our literature, as well as in our architecture. So let's talk about art. A couple things. I'm just going to throw out some names here. Charles Willson Peale, P-E-E-L-E, and John Trumbull. These are artists. They're going to paint a lot of historical scenes. I'm sure you've seen, if you've been in my room or seen my PowerPoints, the painting of the signing of the Constitution or the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Those are paintings by John Trumbull. So they're creating this historical record of events in our early American history. Literature, I think the biggest example I can give you of literature during this time, beyond common sense, is going to be Poor Richard's Almanac. This is going to be written by Benjamin Franklin, and it has just a lot of little pithy stories and stuff like that. But what it does is it actually creates this identity of Americans being this hard-working, industrious group of people. And I think you would agree with me that idea, that perception of Americans still carries on today. That we are a society of hardworking people that are industrious, always seeking a better way to do things. And that's honestly started with Poor Richard's Almanac. And then the architecture, and guys, this is just kind of a side note, but basically we start to see this classical revival of architecture, with this columns and stuff like that. If you look at the buildings of Washington, D.C., you can see that classical style there, or in Jefferson's Monticello and stuff like that. So all of that is going to start to be developed during this time. Did the American national identity come from the European? You know what, Kyle? We're going to take this identity from the Enlightenment and we're going to mold it to fit who we are. So we absolutely have the influence of the Enlightenment. We also absolutely have the influence of this Romanticism from Europe and stuff, but we're going to remold it into the shape of what these Americans are. So we're you kind of, think about it as, we're taking bits and pieces from all these other places and coming together with a brand new identity, if that makes sense. So absolutely influenced, but not completely identical to what's going on over in Europe at this time. Okay? All right, so that's period 3. Now we're going to move on to period 4. Period 4 is going to start with the presidency of Thomas Jefferson. And then what we're going to see is we're going to move into the time period of manifest destiny. You know what? More westward expansion. So let's go ahead and go to the big ideas of period 4. And we're going to look at big idea number 1, where it says, in the era of Jefferson, political parties continued to argue about policy. The Supreme Court established its role in the American government, and the U.S. greatly expanded its territorial holdings. So we're going into period 4, like I said, starting off with Thomas Jefferson. And, Thomas Jefferson coming in, we're still having the debates with our political parties, the debates between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Now, with regards to foreign policy, Thomas Jefferson, the best way we can talk about his foreign policy, how it differs from the 2 previous presidents who were Federalists, is we got to look at the condition or the situation we had with the Barbary pirates. The Barbary pirates were these pirates off of the coast of North Africa that required tribute being paid to them by all the trade vessels coming into the Mediterranean. So basically, if you want to go trade over in that area, you had to pay tribute or you had to pay a bribe to the Barbary pirates. Both Washington and Adams agreed, and they paid that tribute. They didn't even hesitate, which is fascinating since Adams, refused to pay a bribe to the French government. But to the Barbary pirates, both the Federalist presidents, Washington and Adams, paid that tribute. Jefferson is going to refuse. He will not pay tribute, and this is going to lead to the Barbary Wars, or the wars against the Barbary pirates. Now, these are not going to last very long. What we're going to do is we're going to renegotiate with the Barbary pirates, and we're going to actually get a lower, tribute. However, you kind of start to see a little bit of the difference of foreign policy between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. The next thing I want to talk about is, it ties to foreign policy because it's a transaction that we did with France, and that's going to be the Louisiana Purchase. Now remember, the Democratic Republicans believe in a strict interpretation of the U.S. Constitution. So when Jefferson sends a representative over to France to purchase New Orleans, and he ends up buying all of Louisiana, we have to ask ourselves, did Jefferson violate his principles? Did he violate his Democratic Republican principles? Because where in the Constitution does it say that the president has the authority to purchase land? And it doesn't. It absolutely doesn't. But, it's one of those things where, we run into this situation, or Jefferson ran into this situation where it was a deal he couldn't refuse. I mean, how can you refuse 3 cents for an acre of land? The purchase of Louisiana, going to double the size of our country. We're going to send an expedition out there called the Corps of Discovery. That's going to be led by Lewis and Clark. And then also another man who's part of this is going to be Zebulon Pike. They're going to go explore all of this new territory that we got. Lewis and Clark, primarily the northern region. Zebulon Pike, primarily the southern region. Now, interestingly, is as we go west, we're actually going to engage in foreign policy or foreign diplomacy interaction with Native Americans. Lewis and Clark are going to be out there in the West, and they're actually going to be negotiating with a lot of these Native American nations and stuff like that. So that is a form of foreign diplomacy that the Jefferson administration absolutely engages in. Okay, the Supreme Court is going to take on a big role during the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, and hopefully you know, Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution designates the Supreme Court as the center of the judicial branch, but it doesn't really say much about what the Supreme Court is supposed to be doing. It says it has these powers, these judicial powers, but it doesn't say what the powers are. And so what we're going to see happen is in a very important case under the Chief Justice John Marshall in 1803, we're going to determine what the role of the judicial branch is. Now, the case, you've got to know this, is Marbury v. Madison. There's a few cases listed throughout the key concepts of the APUSH curriculum. Marbury v. Madison, you absolutely have to know. And what this case did was it established that the court was the branch of government that would determine the constitutionality of laws. It would be the court that would interpret laws according to the draft of the Constitution. We call that judicial review. And with that, you see the power of the federal judiciary start to grow. John Marshall is going to serve as the Chief Justice for like the next, 40 years or so. And every decision he makes almost actually increases the power of the federal government. Okay, so that's basically... That's big idea number one. We talked about territorial holdings in the Supreme Court and everything. Now let's look at big idea number two. That as the federal power grew during this period, regional interest often conflicted with and opposed it. We're going to start seeing a lot of conflict between the different regions of the country. And you're going to see this conflict, in the sense of how does federal power deal with these regional differences? And it starts really with the War of 1812. Now, this is going to be under the presidency of James Madison. And what we have is we're back to this idea of our sailors are being impressed by the British Navy. Now, we talked about impressment of sailors during period 2. It was going on back then, but it's completely different in 1812 because we're not part of England anymore. I guess you could make an argument that they had the right to impress, colonists, into their navy, but they can't impress American citizens into their navy. And this is going to lead to a declaration of war. I mean, there's going to be several reasons why we declare war on England in the War of 1812. You have the impressment of sailors. You have the actions of the British Army on the western frontier with the Native Americans. We believe that they were arming them and riling them up and stuff like that. So we go into this War of 1812, but what you're going to see is as we enter the war, while it was a very popular war, there were certain regions of our country that disagreed with it. And you're going to have a conflict between those regions and the federal government. Specifically in the War of 1812, it's going to be the New England region. The New England region was predominantly Federalists who are going to be up in that region. They rely on trade. That is their income source. And now, due to an embargo act that was passed by Jefferson and now this war, their livelihood is being threatened. So while the majority of Americans viewed this war as a very popular war, the New England region was staunchly against it. And that's going to lead to what's known as the Hartford Convention. This is going to be a meeting of Federalists in New England where they are actually going to come up with demands of the federal government and threaten to secede, if the government didn't go along with their ideas. Now, what's interesting is, like I said, this war was very popular with the American people. So it's clear at this point that the Federalists just really didn't have a very good indication of how the American people, they didn't have their finger on that, quote, pulse of the nation. They were basically in the minority here. And so the Hartford Convention and this threat to secede if the federal government doesn't line up with what they want is going to be the end of the Federalist Party. But you start to see these regional conflicts start to grow. Now, with the War of 1812, the region that was antagonized is going to be the New England region. Let's talk about another situation, and that's going to be the American system. The American system was Henry Clay's baby. Henry Clay was a member of Congress, and Henry Clay is going to introduce the American system that's going to have three key parts to it. The goal of the American system is to unify our country. It's to unify our country economically. And what we're going to do that with is with internal improvements, with protective tariffs, and with a new national bank. Now, the group or the region that is opposed to the American system is the region that doesn't benefit from the American system, and that's going to be the South. When we talk about infrastructure and internal improvements, most of that's happening in the North and the West. The protective tariffs is going to help the industry in the North. The bank, honestly, is also going to help the businesses and the small farmers in the North and West as well. There was no real benefit for the South. In fact, the American system is going to hurt the South with those protective tariffs. You got to remember, throughout our early American history, anytime a tariff is going to be passed, it's going to hurt the Southern economy because they rely on imports as a lot of their, as part of their economic stability. It's through trade with foreign countries, and they get a lot of imports. And so a protective tariff is just going to raise the prices, and they're not going to be making as much money. So the American system was actually opposed by the Southern region. Now, James Madison, a Southerner himself, was president at this time from the state of Virginia. He is going to go ahead and ratify the National Bank, and he's going to ratify the protective tariff. But he is going to veto the internal improvements. I want to make sure I got that right. He vetoed. Yeah, he vetoed that, and that's in the. And so it's not all going to get through. Now, when Monroe comes in, the next president, he will go ahead and sign off on those improvements. But again, the South doesn't benefit, so that's really going to hurt them. Okay. I talked about the West. I talked about at this point how the American system was helping the West. You got to understand, America is moving further and further west. Again, Western expansion weaved throughout our identity. And we ran into a question during this time, again, a conflict between region and the federal government about how do we expand our country with the question of slavery. And about this time, I mean, I saw this on a video today, guys. Honestly, if you get an essay or a SAQ about anything to do with anything in the years of 1800 to 1898, you might be able just to talk about Western expansion and be able to cover yourself if you have no idea what the question is asking you. Because during the entire 19th century, westward expansion is a big deal in our country. Everything is about westward expansion. And when we go around the 1820s, we're trying to bring in this brand new state into our union as we move west. And the question is that state going to be allowed to have slavery? Because up to this point, we had agreed that, or not we agreed, but we had this idea of a balance between free states and slave states in our Congress. And Missouri is going to come to the front and say, we want to come in. Now, they're going to try to bring it in initially as a free state. The Talmadge Amendment is going to be introduced, and it's going to they're going to attach the Talmadge Amendment to this provision that says that Missouri is going to enter in as a free state. But you have this debate between the federal government and the regional areas. So basically the federal government is saying, yeah, let them come in. let them come in as a free state. But the region, specifically the southern region, says this is going to completely upset the balance that exists within our government right now. It's going to be a political upheaval. And if you're going to let one state in, they're going to allow others to come in. So that's kind of what's going on here. And so the Missouri Compromise is going to be negotiated, and the Missouri Compromise in 1820, also known as the Compromise of 1820, they're interchangeable, is going to allow Missouri to come in as a slave state, and in exchange, Maine's going to come in as a free state. And what they're going to do moving forward is they're going to create the southern border of Missouri, which is the 3630 line, and they're going to use that line as a geographical boundary between free states up here and then slave states below the line. So any new states coming in south of the 3630 line will be slave states. Any states coming in north of the 3630 line will be free states. And this seemed to solve the problem. And, who thought we'd actually ever expand anymore? We got all the land we need. We got the Louisiana Purchase. We don't need anything else. We're not going to expand anymore. This little compromise will solve all our problems, won't it? Well, it did for a time, for a short period of time. But, in 1820, everybody was happy. So we pressed on. Okay. All right. So now let's move on to big idea number 3. And when we get here, we're talking about, during this period, the United States sought to establish its place as an independent nation on the world stage by claiming territory and consolidating control over the Western Hemisphere. Ladies and gentlemen, the United States is going to become a world player. This is about 1823. Several key treaties are going to be signed going into the 18-teens, the 1820s. A lot of them are going to be negotiated by John Quincy Adams, who was the Secretary of State under James Monroe, the president at the time. We're going to negotiate the U.S.-Canadian border, create that at the 49th parallel. That's going to become the permanent border. You're going to see an agreement between Great Britain and the United States to have a joint occupation of the Oregon Territory. And the Adams-Onis Treaty is going to be created in 1819. Now, what this does is this actually cedes Florida to the United States. So we're already starting to see expansion continuing, all right? But here's the big one. We want to exert our power in the world, and we want to take some control of the region we live in. And what we're going to do is we're going to draft the Monroe Doctrine. Now, the Monroe Doctrine was actually part of James Monroe's, I believe, his State of the Union address, and it was written by John Quincy Adams. And what it said was the U.S. wants to extend its sphere of influence throughout the Western Hemisphere. We're basically telling the rest of the world that the United States is not going to allow any more colonial powers to come into this side of the world, whether it's into North America, Central America, or South America. For lack of a better description, no one really took the United States as seriously as we took ourselves at the time. We have England's support with this, but quite honestly, what the Monroe Doctrine is a metaphor of is the United States marking its territory. We're saying this is our realm, this is our sphere, you guys stay out of it. But it's our first step into, I guess global power or global dominance and stuff. And as you know, as we go further into history, that Monroe Doctrine is going to be the foundational element that we're going to use to extend our influence, not just in the Western Hemisphere, but then into other parts of the world as we get, especially into the Cold War, and we start talking about containment and stuff like that. Okay? All right, big idea number 4. And this is a big one, guys. Oops, wrong screen, my bad. The market revolution was linking northern industry with western and southern farms, which was created by advances in technology and had significant effects on the society and culture of the United States. All right, here we go. Market revolution. I need some water to get started. All right, here we go. There is a huge impact when we are going to try to link our northern industry with our southern and western farms. And that's the whole idea of this market revolution. And in linking our economies together, it's going to have a massive impact going forward. Now, it starts with this growth of technology. You can look, at the cotton gin and the spinning jenny and how we can start now quickly starting to make textiles and stuff like that. But then we also see interchangeable parts, which, as you guys know, we're starting to now, instead of just making an individual item, we're making parts for items. So now we can start mass producing items. And what we start seeing is this idea of using interchangeable parts becomes the basis for American manufacturing as we move forward. And as we start to see American manufacturing, you're going to start seeing mass production of goods. And with mass production of goods, you're going to have mass consumption of goods. And all of this is starting during this market revolution. You're also going to see the advent or the invention of steam power. Now, a lot of times we look at steam power with regards to trains and the locomotives, but steam power was initially used on ships. And why this is important is because now with steam powers, ships can move both upstream and downstream. They can go both ways very easily along the rivers and waterways and stuff. And what this is going to do is create more accessibility to all the different regions of our country. So all these goods that are being manufactured in the north and all these agricultural products that are being manufactured or grown in the south and the west can now be moved throughout the country. And we start to see that our economies is starting to be knitted together. Instead of just being regional economies, we're creating a national economy. And what we're seeing is then we're going to take it a step further. We're not just going to depend on, the rivers and the roads and stuff. We're going to start building new roads, and we're going to start building these canals, these man-made waterways to get us where we need to go. I mean, if there's not a river there, let's just put one there. And that way we can get our goods there. And I think probably the most famous canal is going to be the Erie Canal, which connected New York to the Great Lakes. And it's just, like I said, it just expands our economy and expands our markets. And we start to see this regional interdependence on trade. So you start to see the parts of our country, south, northwest, become dependent on one another. And so all of that is going to play a huge role. Now, you're also at the same time going to see this large wave of immigration come in because we're starting to see more jobs being developed with mass production and stuff like that. So there's more opportunity here in the country. And we're going to see our first major wave of immigrants coming into our country. And they're primarily coming from like Germany and Ireland and stuff. But in what is it, the 1820s or something, we're going to see like 2 million immigrants coming into America. And the majority of these folks are going to settle along the eastern seaboard. They're going to settle in urban areas, obviously, because that's where jobs are. But they're also going to move out west because there's land available and stuff to them there. So they're going to move towards the west as well. But predominantly in the urban areas, you're going to start seeing a change in our urban centers. You're going to start seeing a change in the cultures in our urban centers because there's going to be an influence of these immigrants in the cities. They're going to start living in the tenements. The cities are going to start growing. They're going to start building those tenements that, poor ventilation and poor, sanitation and disease is going to start spreading soon. So it wasn't a nice place to live. But what's going to happen is as these immigrants start to come into our country, and it's not just with this first wave, but we're going to see it in the 1900s as well, they're going to start going to where there's people like them. And so you're going to start seeing these cultural centers being created within the cities. And you're going to start seeing these ethnic enclaves in every single city starting to grow and everything like that. And all of this is a result of the market revolution because of the jobs and the more opportunities that are now available in our country. You're also going to see the development of a new economic class because of the market revolution, and that's going to be the middle class. You're going to see people starting to grow in prosperity. You're going to see businessmen and merchants and doctors and lawyers, and they're not vastly wealthy, but they're prospering. They're doing pretty well. They're middle class. So that's going to happen. And then the role of women. We're going to see the effect of all of this on women as well, especially in this new middle class. Now, I talked about, in period 3, Republican motherhood. Here's another term you need to know with regards to women during this fourth period of time, the period 4 of our curriculum. Cult of domesticity. And this is especially prevalent in the middle class. And what this is that they said that men and women had different spheres of existence in society. And a woman's sphere of existence was in the home. And it was her responsibility to provide a haven within the home for her family and for her husband. And that's where she should be. She should be at home. She should be taking care of the kids. She should be providing a good home life for the men as they're out working. Not a very, progressive idea in today's world, but that was what's going on during this time. And all these ideas, guys, the rise of the middle class, the immigrants coming over, the economies being intertwined, all of this is a result. We call all this part of the market revolution. So that's a very important period that you should be familiar with going forward, okay? All right, we're getting there. What time is it? Oh my gosh. See, I told you there's no way I could do it in less than an hour. All right, we are on big idea number 5. Big idea number 5 is during this period, the demand for expanding democracy manifested itself into universal white male suffrage and the growing influence of political parties. All right, guys, stick with me here. 1819, America experiences an economic panic, the Panic of 1819. It was basically an economic depression in our country. Banks were failing, unemployment was going up. And the people who were hit the hardest were the laboring men, these guys who were working in these early factories that were starting to grow and working in the cities. The problem was these men were being affected by a failing economy that was probably based on some decisions that the government was making, yet they didn't have the power to vote. Only men who owned property had the power to vote. And so you're going to have a call for the removal of property requirements from the voting rules. Now, what's interesting is as you go further west, they have already started to remove those requirements. But in the eastern, especially in the urban areas, they were still requiring property ownership before you could vote. So they're going to start pushing for this, and one of the biggest purveyors of that is going to be Andrew Jackson. By 1825, most states had removed those property requirements for voting rights. So now all white men will have the right to vote. This is what we call universal male suffrage. And these men, these laborers, are referred to often as the common man, okay? That's going to bring us to a realignment of political parties. The Democratic Republicans have had a nice long run. Once, the Federalists lost all their power after the Hartford Convention, as we go into the 18-teens and the early 1820s, it's been all Democratic Republicans. But by 1824, we're starting to see a split in the party. We're starting to see a realignment. And what we have is we have the National Republicans who, I guess if you want to give them tie them to something, you're going to tie them to a loose interpretation of the Constitution. So you have the National Republicans, and then you have the Democrats, and they believed in more of a strict interpretation of the Constitution. And so now we have this new political realignment, this new party system in our government, and that's going to take us to big idea number 6, which is President Andrew Jackson made profound use of federal power on issues like the national bank, tariffs, federally funded internal improvements, and the forcible removal of American Indians from their lands. All right, that was a mouthful. Okay. By the time Jackson becomes president, our two parties are officially the Democrats, who are run by, or the head guy is Andrew Jackson, and the National Republicans have now taken on the title Whigs. And the Whigs are led primarily by Henry Clay. Now, when we talk about the Jackson presidency, literally we could talk for another hour. I just want you to know 3 key points about his presidency. You need to know about the Tariff of Abominations. You need to know about his war on the bank, and you need to know about the Indian Removal Act. If you know those three things, you'll be good. Now, the Tariff of Abominations was a protective tariff. We've had tariffs, but the problem was they call it the Tariff of Abominations because it raised that tax by 50%. The North loved it. The North, the urban areas loved it because it's going to drive up their industry. The South hated it because it's costing them a fortune. It's cutting into all their profits. And so what you're going to have is you're going to have John C. Calhoun, the Vice President of the United States, Vice President under Andrew Jackson, but from South Carolina, is going to call for the nullification of this tax. He's going all the way back to the 1790s when Jefferson and Madison wrote the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, which said if a state deems a law unconstitutional, that state can nullify it. John C. Calhoun is going to say this protective tariff is not constitutional because it's not protecting the general welfare of the people of the South. And due to that, South Carolina needs to nullify this law. Well, you're going to have a lot of back and forth between South Carolina and the federal government, threats of fighting and threats of war, and the Congress is going to pass the Force Bill, which will give Jackson the power to take the military down into South Carolina and force the collection of this tariff. Henry Clay is going to step in. They're going to negotiate a lower tariff, but again, that idea of nullification has reared its head, and it's not going away. It's been quelled, it's been tamed for the moment, but it's still there, okay? So that's the Tariff of Abominations. The second thing is the war on the bank. Andrew Jackson believed that the banks were unconstitutional. As a Democrat, he believed in a strict interpretation of the Constitution. He believed that the banks favored the rich over the poor. Andrew Jackson was the representative of the common man, the guy who had to work hard and everything. And so he said these banks are not helping the common man. They tend to help the rich more, which honestly was probably true. But in order to prevent this from happening any further, he is going to veto the rechartering of the bank that was established with the American system. And he's going to move federal funds into state banks. And we're not going to have a national bank again. So his war on the bank, he said when he ran for office, he was going to kill the bank, and he absolutely did that, okay? So that's the second thing you need to know. The third thing you need to know about is probably what most people know about Andrew Jackson, and that's going to be the Indian Removal Act of 1830. What this did was it set up legislation to remove Native Americans from their ancestral lands, primarily in the East, and move them to beyond the Mississippi to the Oklahoma Territory. Again, because we have no plans to expand any further west, that's fine. They'll just go there. Now, honestly, the majority of these Native Americans go voluntarily. They'll leave their ancestral homes and they will go to the Oklahoma Territory. But those that didn't are going to be forcibly removed from their land several years later. Actually, this is going to be known as the Trail of Tears. It's actually going to occur during the next president's administration, but it's due to the Indian Removal Act that is going to be signed into law by Andrew Jackson. But again, this forced removal of Native Americans is referred to as the Trail of Tears. Okay, so that's really what you need to know about Andrew Jackson, those three big things. Moving on, we're going to get to, we only got three more of these to do. Big idea number 8 is going to be, I skipped 7. Big idea number 7 is going to be Americans labored during this period to define a distinct American identity through language, philosophy, art, and religion. Okay, here we go. A new step in American identity. The big idea, the big philosophy during this time period is called transcendentalism. Transcendentalism. It's based on European Romanticism and this idea of human perfection. These two ideas coming over, and that's going to come over here to America. And transcendentalists, they believed in the power and the beauty of nature, and they believed in the power of the individual. And what they did is they looked to nature and said, how can I learn from nature? And how can I take what I learned from nature and make myself better? Some of the big ideas you need, or names you need to know from the Transcendentalists is going to be Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. Now, while Transcendentalism looked to nature for guidance, again, it was all about improving the individual. At the same time, you're going to see Transcendentalist ideas come through in the art of the time. Be familiar with the Hudson River School. Remember, that was a group of artists that painted a whole lot of landscapes and sceneries, predominantly of New York and Western America. It was a romanticized view of landscapes. I mean, when we looked at these paintings, they're near perfection. I mean, when you look at it, and that's what they saw, the perfection of nature, and they wanted to see that come within the individual as well. But you also had another movement during this time. Transcendentalism, you can almost flip back to some of the Enlightenment ideas, the ideas of how can we make ourselves better here in our mind. But you had this other movement that you can trace back to the First Great Awakening. And it's a religious movement during this time period called the Second Great Awakening. And now we're dealing with our heart. So once again, it's our mind versus our heart. And the difference, though, is in the First Great Awakening, we looked for personal reformation through the idea of applying Christ's teachings to our individual lives. In the Second Great Awakening, we're looking towards how we can take those teachings and apply them to the morality of society. How can we make society better using our faith? And you're going to see people like Charles Finney. He's one of the leaders of the Second Great Awakening. And you're going to see these camp meetings, these revivals start to take place. And these were just what they sounded like. You'd go out into this large field and you'd have these big meetings where people would come from all over to hear the teaching of the gospel and how you could take that out into the world and make the world a better place. And what's very fascinating about the Second Great Awakening and about these camp meetings is they were very egalitarian. Egalitarian is one of those words that you need to know, and it just means equal. There was equality in these camp meetings. It didn't matter if you were a man, a woman, an African American, an immigrant, an Irish, German, whatever. You were all treated equally in these camp meetings. It was probably the most egalitarian community in all of the 1800s. Was during this time, during the Second Great Awakening. Now, this idea of the transcendentalism and the focus on making the individual better, and the Second Great Awakening and the focus of going out and making society better is going to lead us to big idea number 8. That the rise of democratic and individualistic beliefs and the social changes brought on by the market revolution are going to lead to a significant effort to reform American society. We want to make America better. We see some failures in America and we need to make it better. So we're going to talk about several movements. The first one is the temperance movement. My glasses are crooked. It bugs me when I see that. The temperance movement. And what this was this is a movement that's going to start in about the 1830s and 40s and go all the way until the 1920s. And what the temperance movement was working for was the complete abstinence, or the complete end of usage of alcohol in society. Alcohol ran rampant during this time. There were a lot of drinking. There was a lot of drunkardness and stuff like that. The temperance movement is pushing for complete abstinence during this time. Another movement during this time is going to be the abolition movement. A name you need to know with the abolition movement is probably William Lloyd Garrison. He is the editor and creator of The Liberator, an American newspaper focused on the abolishment of slavery. He's also going to start the American Anti-Slavery Society. Emancipation was becoming reality in the North. We know that. But what you also have to realize, guys, is be very clear going forward. Even when we get into the 1860s, 1870s, 1900s, emancipation doesn't result in the end of racial tensions. we can see the moral problems with slavery. That doesn't mean we're going to see everyone else as equals. So just keep that in mind going forward. But you are going to have this emancipation movement in the North and this push for the end of slavery in the South. I mentioned this before. This was a relatively new movement. You're not going to see a whole lot of follow through or a whole lot of influence in the beginning, but it's starting. And you're also going to have an abolition movement in the South. You're actually going to have black Southerners, free and slave, who are working for abolition during this time. And the result of this is going to bring us to another slave rebellion that you should be familiar with, and that's the Nat Turner Rebellion. The Nat Turner Rebellion is going to be a rebellion where slaves are able to arm themselves. They're going to start marching through several different plantations. And in the end, about 50 plus white people are going to be killed by Nat Turner and his followers. Now, the rebellion is going to be put down, but it has a very important result. When news of the Nat Turner Rebellion spreads, when news of the idea of these 50 plus people being killed, spread, there's going to be a fear that is going to rise throughout the South of more revolts. And because of that, because there's a fear of more slave revolts, you're going to see a lot more rules and a lot more poor treatment of the slaves to keep them under control, to keep them from being able to start up another revolt. I mean, things like it's going to become illegal to teach them to read. In some places, it's illegal for slaves to be anywhere alone or, traveling alone and stuff like that. So you're going to see a lot more controls of slavery being put in place in the South due to the fear of additional revolts going forward. All right, that's going to take us... Oh, wait, then the women's movement. Oh, my gosh, forgive me. I almost forgot the women's movement during this time period. I talked about all the other movements. Women's movement, 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention. Very important you know this one. That's a date you need to know. 1848, Seneca Falls Convention. It's here that the Declaration of Sentiments is going to be drafted. It's supposed to mirror the Declaration of Independence, except it's focusing on political rights for women. And they don't just want political rights as far as voting rights. That's absolutely what they want to do. They want women's suffrage, but they also want educational rights. They also want legal rights and property rights. And they want to basically become equals in society. And that movement is starting here. They're breaking away from that cult of domesticity and saying, our sphere goes a lot farther than the home. So you're going to see that start up here now. But remember, women aren't going to get the national right to vote until 1920. So very similar to the temperance movement, this is going to continue through the 1800s into the early 1900s. All right, here we go. The very last big idea of this time period, and that's going to be big idea number 9. Though the majority of Southern white people did not own enslaved people, Southern culture ensured that the institution of slavery was part of the South's way of life, and thus it was to be protected. All right. In the South, misconception a lot of people have, the majority of people did not own slaves. These people were typically called yeoman farmers. These are small, independent landowners that really didn't have a lot of extra money, so they didn't own slaves. But just because they didn't own slaves didn't mean they didn't support this institution of slavery. The Southern economy, the Southern culture at this time was defined by agriculture. And it's also defined by a racial hierarchy, almost their own caste system. And obviously the large landowners are at the top. But this caste system, this hierarchy was all about, land ownership. These yeoman farmers, they might not be at the top, but because of slavery, they're not at the bottom either. And so what they're aspiring to move up that hierarchy, so that's why they support the institution of slavery. You're also going to see during this time is that a new crop with the invention from the market revolution, the invention of cotton gin. Cotton is becoming the primary crop of the South. And because of this, cotton is being planted all over the place. And what you're going to start seeing happening is the soil that the cotton is being planted in is starting to be depleted. So these southern farmers, yeoman farmers, large plantation owners, they're starting to look for new lands with more arable soil that they can move to. And so what you're going to start seeing as a result of this is more westward expansion. And that's going to bring up a whole slew of problems in our next time period. Okay. Woo, wow, not even close to under an hour. We went almost an hour and a half, but we covered a whole lot of information. Now's the time, if you have questions, to go ahead and post them up. I appreciate you guys sticking with me. I'm sure some of you guys stuck with me all the way through, and I appreciate that. I had some people coming in and out, but hopefully that helps you guys to understand periods 3 and 4, and understand what's going on in our country. We have a new national identity. We have, we're expanding, we're growing, and so all of that's going on, and that's going to lead us into this next time period where tomorrow night I'm going to talk about periods 5 and 6. Where we're literally going into the American Civil War and then beyond into the Gilded Age. So we're going to complete the 19th century tomorrow night. But what I want to know right now is, do you have any questions that I can answer for you tonight? I got this 30-second delay. This 30-second delay is the hardest thing to deal with on these live things. That and the yahoos that get on and start posting bad things and having to click them off before they get too out of hand. So, all right. Any questions I can answer? Nothing's coming up, and I'm trying not to cut it off too soon. Okay. So if there's nothing coming up, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and cut off my feed so you can't see my face. I'll put up my title slide for just another minute or so. I'll let that play. So if you have any questions, you can go ahead and put them in the chat, and I'll go ahead and answer them. But other than that, guys, you have a great evening, and we will see you tomorrow night when we're covering periods 5 and 6, which is going to take us from the Mexican-American War all the way up to 1898 and almost the beginning of American imperialism. So we'll see you tomorrow night. Bye-bye. because for some reason my chat's not working. So, Kyle, you asked me to go over the split between the Democrats, the Democratic Party split in period 4. That's going to be a split between, you're going to see the Democratic Republicans, they're going to split into the National Republicans, who will become the Whigs, and they believe in a loose interpretation of the Constitution. And you see, and they also have the Democrats, who believe in a strict interpretation of the Constitution. What that's growing out of is the conflict of the regions and the role of the federal government in that conflict. So basically, the question is about the power of the federal government, and the National Republicans believe that the government has some more power to do certain things like building canals, building roads, and stuff like that, where the Democrats believe that that was more of a state power. And so you start to see this slow split start to evolve in the late 18 teens going into the 1820s. And then it's just going to be spurred on by the debate over voting patterns of the common man and stuff like that. And then, so hopefully that answers your question, Kyle. I'm sorry, I was trying to type it in the chat. And then someone asked me, could I go over the definition of the market revolution again? The market revolution was basically a time period of technological advances. And what we're going to see happen is, because of those technological advances, you're going to see our economy start to grow. And with that, with the growth of our economy, you're going to see the different regions of our economy become intertwined. So the North is not just going to be dependent on its production in the North. It's also going to become reliant on the cotton being produced in the South, so they can create textiles. And you're going to have trading going back and forth between the different regions and everything like that. So when you think of the market revolution, think about the growth of a national economy in America versus regional economies. Okay, and so we're going to see that, that connection or that unification of our country come together under this economy. And it was all spurred by new technologies that are going to be introduced. Okay, so hopefully you guys are still on and you're seeing that. And hopefully that answered both of your questions. So with that, I'm going to say goodnight. And I'm going to stop streaming and stop living, and I'll see you tomorrow night. Bye-bye.